Well, today we are coming to the end of Matthew chapter 5, if you can believe it, in our series, Upside Down Kingdom. For those of you who have been with us, you know that we've been in this journey through this first and most really famous sermon that Jesus ever preached. It's more commonly known as the Sermon on the Mount, and it is a description of what life in the kingdom of God looks like and what citizens of this kingdom of God act like. And as we've said through the weeks, this kingdom life, it not only ran counter to the culture of which the people in Jesus' day lived, it runs counter to the culture of our day as well. And it not only does that, this kingdom life actually runs against human nature at times. This kingdom is a kingdom where hurtful words mean as much as hurtful actions. It's a kingdom that not only cares about what you do sexually with your body, but what your eyes do, what you think about. It's a kingdom where you don't treat people as disposable. And in a world where everyone has a motive and everyone has, some aim on something, where it's acceptable to stretch the truth and deceive people, this is a kingdom of people who are truth bearers and seekers. In a world that says get even, this is a kingdom of people who say turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. And in a world that says love those people who are like you, who love you, this is a kingdom that says love those people who hate you. Do good to those who treat you badly. To be sure, it is an upside down kingdom. And all those illustrations that Jesus has given that we have been looking at over the past several weeks, all were examples of what Jesus meant when he told his followers that unless their righteousness exceeds or goes beyond, actually goes deeper than the righteousnesses of the scribes and the Pharisees and the teachers of his day, he said, well, you can't be a part of this kingdom. And last week we began our sixth illustration that Jesus uses, and it was this: love your enemies. And I saw a clip probably, 6 or 8 weeks ago. It's really about a baseball game, and I'm not sure if you saw the story, but I think it's a great introduction to what Jesus is leading us into. In this clip, the 12-year-old pitcher for the Texas East Little League team has just pitched a ball that has hit another 12-year-old Oklahoma batter in the head. Well, it hits him in the head. He kind of flips around. His helmet comes off. He falls to the ground. And what happened next, though, I think is the most incredible part of this story, and I think an illustration of where Jesus is leading us in this illustration. Watch the screen with me.
Oh, look out.
Oh, my God.
That's awesome. Wow, that is a tough kid right there.
Hey, Jarvis, and hit his helmet.
So this is really cool because as a pitcher, Bubs looks shaken up right now because of what he did. And look at Zay Jarvis. This is such great sportsmanship. He wants him to know that it's okay, that he'll be fine.
Hey, bro.
You're doing it. Right, let's go.
Look at me. Look at me. You're all right.
Amazing.
You're all right? Look at me. Hey, look. You can do it.
What a stud right there. Zay Jarvis.
Well, it might have been a baseball game, but I think it is an excellent introduction into where Jesus is leading us. I once read these words: how can I love my enemies when I have a hard time even liking my friends? Anybody relate to that at times? We begin this section of Jesus' sermon in verse 43 of Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus tells us what the people of his day were teaching about this particular subject with your enemies, when he begins with these words: you have heard that it was said. Again, Jesus is pointing them back to what the law of Moses said, but it's not exactly what the law of Moses said. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And when Jesus says you have heard that it was said, he is not replacing or doing away with the law of Moses. Moses, rather he is redefining what the religious leaders of his day were saying and how they were interpreting the law of Moses. So what I want to do is go back and dive back in by putting the actual words of Moses on the screen, and then look at what Jesus says he was saying and seeing where we go from there. So if you put Leviticus 19 back up, I've shortened it to just the part that pertains to this. What Moses actually said was this: love your neighbor as yourself. But by the time that gets to the days of Jesus, what they were teaching was this: love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Well, as we looked at last week, the law of Moses did say love your neighbor, but it never said what? It never said hate your enemy. That's right, they made that part up. Some of the rabbis and the teachers of Jesus' day were saying, well, if the law is to love your neighbor, well, then the other half of that, or the opposite of that, must be true. If I'm to love my neighbor, then the law was allowing me to hate my enemy, which the law never did, as we'll see. Others who wanted an out, if you will, to treat everyone with love, came up to this way of thinking, and they said, well, if I have to love my neighbor, then what I'll do is this. If I want to out to not loving certain people, I'll just redefine who my neighbor is. And anyone who doesn't meet my definition of neighbor, well, then I don't have to love them. So they narrowed down the definition of who their neighbor was, so that by the time Jesus comes along, they could legally narrow down who they would love. And they ended up defining their neighbor as someone from their race. Someone who looked like them, walked like them, talked like them, believed like them, acted like them. So much that by the time Jesus is teaching on this, they legally justified treating anyone who didn't meet that criteria of neighbor any way they wanted, even as an enemy. And second, not only had they added these words, hate your enemy, what had they left out from this sentence down here? That's right, I heard somebody say it, as yourself. They had completely left that part out. So from the time of Moses had given the law to the days of Jesus, they had both narrowed down who they would love by defining who their neighbor was, but they had also completely taken out the standard of what that love was supposed to look like, and that was a love like you love yourselves. Well, before we leave talking about what the law actually said, I want to show you a couple of other things that the law said, because I think it is relevant in what Jesus is going to say next. Well, in the same chapter of Leviticus, not only does he say, love your neighbor as yourself, look at what else he says. Verse 9, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field. Now, who does that in this day and age? If you've got a farmer, if you've got a crop, well, you want all of it, don't you? I mean, you want to get it all in. But God tells his people, when you reap to the edge of your land, do not reap the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Now, why would God tell Moses to tell his people that? Well, let's let God put it the way he puts it. He said, this is the reason. Because I want you to leave some for the poor and the, say that word with me, foreigner. Do you know that word foreigner is simply a word they use for anyone who wasn't Jewish? Someone who didn't look like them, behave like them, act like them. Somebody who didn't have the same customs and traditions as they would have had. Someone for them who wasn't from the lineage and line of Abraham. You see, under the law of Moses, even, a law that can seem harsh at times, God cared about the way his people treated those who were different, those who were not like them. And God goes on to say, just in case you missed it the first time, I'm going to reveal to you further how I want to treat the foreigners of your land. Look at what he says, same chapter, going down to verse 33. When a foreigner, again, someone who is not you, someone who is not Jewish, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigners residing among you must be treated. And how do you think he's going to say they should treat? Well, they were used to treating them as enemies. They were used to treating them as outsiders. What is God going to tell his people to? How's he going to tell them to treat the people who are not like them, who didn't come from where they came from, who weren't born as children of Abraham? Well, this is what he says. The foreigners who are residing among you must be treated, get this, as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were once foreigners in Egypt. It's like he says, you know what it was like to live in a land not your own. You know what it was like to be treated unjustly and unfairly. So you are not only to leave food at the edges of your fields, food that they don't even have to ask for. They can just come up and take because you remember how the Egyptians treated you, and you wanted them to treat you in a good way. So not only leave food where anyone passing by can get it, you treat outsiders just like you treat your native-born citizens, the way you want to be treated. Well, that's what the law of Moses said, but they were not following it. In fact, they had strayed so far from it that they had developed a system that allowed them not to love, but to hate anyone who wasn't Jewish. And this idea, as we said last week, was so pervasive that Jesus devoted an entire parable to one of the lawyers, one of the experts, one of the Pharisees who had come up to him and seeking a way to justify him narrowly defining who his neighbor was. He asked Jesus a question, who is my neighbor? And it's where we get the story of the Good Samaritan. And what he and the rest of the crowd that day were surprised to find out is that the hero of the story Jesus tells in the Good Samaritan was not the religious people. The hero in the story was not the priest who passed by. It was not the Levite who passed by. The hero of the story was a Samaritan, someone his audience would have seen as an enemy. And get this, someone that the guy who was beaten up beside the road and left would have seen as an enemy, as an outsider, as a foreigner. And to complete the circle, someone that the Samaritan himself would have seen as an outsider, an enemy. But in the story Jesus tells, it was the Samaritan who showed love for the Jewish guy who had been beaten up and left for dead. But he not only showed a concern for him, he treated the person like he would have wanted to have been treated. Which brings us to our third question with this love your enemies illustration. What did Jesus really say about loving your enemies? And that's where Jesus gives us what I believe to be are some of the most radical, countercultural, hard-to-do commands that he ever spoke. When he looked at that crowd and said, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I tell you, love your, not neighbors, that would be easy. Not neighbors, although you should. And not just your friends, although I hope you do and will. And not just those who think like you, vote like you, act like you, believe like you, or come from the same country you come from. That's what you've heard. That's what they're out there teaching you right now. But I'm telling you something else. I say to you, love your, what's the word there again? Enemies. And again, Jesus isn't adding to the law of Moses or even changing the law of Moses. He is reminding them of what was to be true of God's people from the very beginning of time. And in addition to the things that we've already looked at that were already under the law, leave some of your crop around the edges and treat the foreigners in your land like they were native born. Look at what else the law of Moses says to treat the people who are around you, like Exodus 23:4. If you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it. If that happens to any of you today, make sure, get the donkey, get the ox back in. But can you see, if you compare that to our day and age today, if you see somebody who's hurting, do what? And not just the people you like. What's the word he uses? I mean, it would be easy to go get my friend's donkey and to try to get it out of the road, but my enemy's donkey? Come on, Jesus. Then he goes on. Next verse. He says, verse 5, if you see the donkey of someone who hates you, I mean, not just someone that you might hate, but someone who hates you. You got nothing against them, but they hate you. Well, what does he want you to do? Well, if it's fallen down and under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help what? Your enemy with it. And then next verse, verse 9. Do not oppress a person who is not Jewish, a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners because you were foreigners in Egypt. And then it doesn't stop there. If you go all the way to the book of Proverbs, wisest man who ever lived said these words, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. And then what's amazing is that the Apostle Paul is going to remind Christians who were living in Rome of this same command. In fact, he's going to quote it to the people living in Rome. And what you have to remember about the Christians who were living in Rome is this. Rome was their enemy. Rome had set itself up against Christianity and had set out to destroy it. If you were a Christian living in Rome in the days that Paul was writing his letter to the Romans, you had to decide every day when you got out of bed whether you would live in opposition to this king one more day. Because if you were to stand up for this king, you might find yourself being set on fire to light one of the Roman parties. You would find yourself at a minimum being persecuted and beaten, thrown into the arena to be eaten by wild beasts to entertain the Roman citizens. And to the Christians living under those conditions, Paul wrote these words in Romans chapter 12. Bless those who persecute you. Bless those who are trying to set you on fire, saw you in half, feed you to the wild beast, drag you from your families. Bless them. Do not repay evil for evil. Do not take revenge. This is where he quotes Solomon. If your enemy, who would have been the very government they found themselves living under in oppression to, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. When I tell you that it was the most radical, against human nature type of behavior that ever existed, this is it. If we have a problem with it today, you don't have a problem with me. You got a problem with Jesus. You got a problem with Moses. You got a problem with Paul. Because Paul says this is not a nationalist type of religion that you have been born into. This is a religion that goes against everything that is in your society. It is a religion that treats people like people regardless of how the people treat you. And I would suggest to you that this radical, difficult, hard to do, countercultural command to love your enemies is exactly what Jesus was saying would set his people apart from the rest of the world and would in fact one day change the world. Well, how do you love like that? How do we do that? It sounds good, but who does that? Well, it starts a little bit with knowing a little bit about this word love right here. Love. We use love for all types of things, don't we? How many of you love pizza? How many of you love your mama? How many of y'all that means the same thing? I hope not. It's like, oh, I love your outfit today, and I love your brother. I love that thought. Well, I love the Predators. Such a wide range of emotions that describe things that we use just one word for. Is it true that I love pizza? Yes. Is it true that I love my mother? Yes. But does that word love really contain, does it express the same thought when I put those in comparison with each other? I hope not. See, the Greeks had a lot of words for that word love. One of them they had was this. It was the word eros. It's the word for romantic love. It was sexual love that existed between a husband and wife. It's where we get our English word. Anybody know? Yeah, I heard it out there, erotic. That's right. They had a word for it. It was a deep type of friendship word. It was called philia. Philia. Anybody know where we got a city in the United States kind of named after that? Anybody remember? Philadelphia, right? The city of what? Brotherly love. And they had some other words for love themselves, but without dispute, the most radical, the most selfless, the most over-the-top type of love was a love that they called this word right here, agape. C.S. Lewis referred to that type of love as a gift of love. It's a love that isn't earned. It's a love that isn't deserved. It's a love that isn't based on how the object of that love returns it or responds. It's not a I'll love you when type of love, and it's not an I'll love you if type of love. It is, as C.S. Lewis said, that love that is simply given. It's pre-decided. It is a choice. And here is what separates agape love from any of these other types of love. Agape love is not a feeling. Agape love is an action. It's an action. And while it would be good if we could have a loving feeling towards our enemies, let's know what Jesus is asking us to do. He's not scolding us or the people who don't like us or the people that we may not necessarily like because we don't have loving feelings towards them. He's not calling the righteous brothers unrighteous because they somehow woke up and lost that loving feeling that they once had. Did y'all get that? I slipped that in there. You see, he wasn't saying, I command you to have good feelings towards those people who slap you on one cheek. He wasn't saying, I command you to have good feelings toward those people who want to sue you and take your shirt, or toward those people who want to force you to work for them. Jesus says this isn't about your feelings. This is about your actions. This is about how you respond to your feelings. And when Jesus says to love our enemies, the word he uses is agape. If you were to read it again, it would go like this. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I say to you, agape your enemies. The thought is brought out more as the verse continues in verse 44. But I tell you, love or agape your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And while it's almost impossible to have a loving feeling towards someone who is persecuting you, and again, that is not even what Paul was asking the Roman Christians to do, to have a loving feeling towards those ones who were killing them. He was saying, in spite of the way you feel, I still want you to act in love towards them. And that is more possible than it is to have a feeling that way. It's often impossible to feel that, but it is possible sometimes to act that way. I once heard a pastor at a church in Birmingham, Alabama, tell a story about two guys who were in the same business. Both of these guys attended his church. Both of these guys were competitors to each other, and both of these guys considered themselves Jesus followers. But they had gotten into an advertising war that had turned ugly, and the whole town and the whole church knew it had turned ugly. One day, one of them, a guy named Bob, walked into the pastor's office and said, Pastor, I need some advice. Do you know Joe? Pastor said, yeah, I know Joe. He goes, well, you know what's been going on. Pastor says, yeah, I know what's been going on. Everybody in the church and in the community know what's been going on. Bob looks at the pastor and says, well, then you know that I hate him and he hates me. This has turned ugly and I'm not sure what to do. I'm not sure where to go with this. It's gotten completely out of hand. And the pastor thought for a moment and he said, well, I think I know something that would help, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. Well, the guy, he got a little bit upset and he said, well, why don't you tell me? Pastor says, I'm not going to tell you because I don't think you would do it anyway. The guy says, come on now, Pastor, come on. You got to tell me. If you think this would help, if you think that there was a way that we could get past this, you owe it to me to tell you. Well, the pastor looks at Bob and says, well, I'll tell you, but I'm going to put some conditions on it. First condition is this. You got to promise. Do you promise that you'll do it? Guy looks and says, this has gone too far. I promise that I'll do it. He says, I don't want you to promise that you'll do it. I want you to shake that you'll do it. He says, okay, I'll shake that I'll do it. He goes, and then I'm going to give you a piece of paper, just submit it, and I want you to sign that you'll do it. He said, how far are you going to go? He goes, I just want to make sure that me and you are on the same wavelength, that if I tell you, you're going to do what I say to do. God says, okay, I promise. What is it that you want me to do? He says, tonight when you go home, and every night until I tell you differently, I want you to get down on your hands and knees, and I want you to pray for Joe. And then he says, and I want you to pray that God blesses Joe's business more than he blesses your business. Well, the pastor said that Bob got so mad. He said he got up. He said, you tricked me. And he said his neck began to shake and his things began to quiver. And he said, that's not fair. Pastor said, oh, I don't care if it's fair. I don't care if it's fair. That's why you have shaken on it. You have agreed to it. And now you're about to sign. And he says, no one forced you to do it. And Bob, after fuming for a minute, said, okay. Pastor pushes a piece of paper over towards him and says, write this down. I, Joe, will pray for Bob. I, Bob, will pray for Joe. I, Bob, will pray for Joe. And his business. And his business. Every day. Every day. And God bless Joe. And God bless Joe. And God bless Joe. More than he blesses you. More than he blesses you. Not you. Me. And if you don't, write it down, write it down. And if I don't, you owe me. I owe you. I know, you don't have to say it. My business. Pastor says, sign it. Bob signs it. About shoves a piece of paper across the desk at the pastor. The pastor looks at him and says, now you come see me in a couple of months and let's talk about what's going on. Well, Bob turns around, walks out, slams the door. Pastor sees Bob the next week at church and doesn't even say anything to him because he just gives him the look, and pastor knows things are not going well in Tinseltown tonight. He's still as grumpy as ever. 3 weeks pass. Pastor gets enough nerve and he looks and he says, Bob, tell me how things are going. How's your prayer life? Bob says, you really want to know how my prayer life is? Pastor says, yeah, I want to know how your prayer life is. I wouldn't have asked if I didn't want to know. He says, well, I'll tell you what, every night I do just what you said because I don't want you to own my business. Every night I get down on my knees and I get beside my bed and I say, God, bless Joe. And then I say, God, would you bless Joe more than you bless me? And would you make his business prosper? And I say all this other stuff. And then I get off my knees, Pastor, and I look up into heaven and I say to God, you know I don't mean a word of that. Pastor says, great job, Bob. Keep up the good work. Bob walks out. Long story short, 6 months later, Joe and Bob are advertising their businesses in the same paper, in the same ad. And on the way out one Sunday, Pastor asked Bob, what happened? I see you and Joe are advertising together. I see you're even sitting together at service. Bob said, Pastor, what you asked me to do was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. But somewhere along the way, it became hard to continue to hate someone that I was asking God to bless. So one day on a whim, I picked up the phone and I said, Joe, want to go for some coffee? Joe said yes, and the rest is history. Why would you do that? Why would Jesus ask you to pray for those who persecute you? Because Jesus knows it is often difficult to continue to hate somebody that you're asking God to bless. But that was just the surface reason. You want to know the real reason? It's because of what Jesus said next in verse 45. So that you may be the children of your Father who is in heaven. And he's not saying that that's how you become children of your Father in heaven. I love the version that says, when you love your enemies and when you pray for those who persecute you, you show yourselves to be children of your Father who is in heaven. Remember, this entire sermon is not about how to get into the kingdom of God. This entire sermon is about what people who are in the kingdom of God, citizens of the kingdom of God, act like, how they live. And Jesus is saying this kind of upside down behavior, well, that's how I know who my kids are. In fact, they share something in common with their heavenly Father. He continues in verse 45. This is what they share. He says, for he, speaking of God, he causes whose son? His son to rise on the evil and on the good. And he sends whose rain? His rain on the just and the unjust. Some of your versions will say on the righteous and on the unrighteous. Jesus says, think about it. Although this world is broken, your heavenly Father doesn't sit up in heaven and say, well, Tom was bad today. I think I'm going to withhold the sunshine from him. Linda was good, so it's going to shine over there. It's not going to shine over here on Tom. And to a society that made their living by crops and raising things in the field and water for the cattle and sunshine for things to go, he says, I'm not looking at your neighbor out there who is doing things wrong and gone off track. I'm not looking at them and saying, well, you know what? No sunshine for them today. Your farm has sunshine, their farm, and no sunshine. I'm not looking and deciding and saying, well, I think I'm going to send rain here, and I don't think I'm going to send rain there because they are bad. Jesus says, it's the best of both worlds. You get rewarded when you're good, sunshine and rain, and you get rewarded when you're bad, sunshine and rain. Jesus says you can look at the way God has set up this world that we live in. He's not up there doling out his gifts to people based on how good or how bad they are. He's not deciding which stream will water the good person and the bad person. And that's not saying that bad people will not have to answer one day for what they have done. It is saying that God's people leave that day for God himself. But what Jesus is saying and what Moses is saying is there is a sense in which God is generous to all. God has chosen to act in agape, to perform acts of kindness towards the people we call good and towards the people we may call bad. You see, it may not be a choice in how I feel about them. That's often, it's hard to get out. But he says it is a choice, Tom, in how you act towards them. And Jesus says if you want to show yourself to be children of your Father in heaven, well, then you will not withhold kindness. The person you're withholding it from may have done all types of bad things, but to agape them is to choose to love them like Jesus did. There is a type of love where I do something for someone that I love because I love them and it means something to me and I want to be around them. But there is a type of love that I'm going to call this morning loving someone as an enemy. Loving someone who doesn't do good for you. That type of love is a love that I choose to do for you. In spite of what you are doing to me, can you love somebody you don't like? Well, yeah. Because what Jesus is talking about is not how you feel towards them. He's talking about how you act towards them. You see, it's not necessarily wrong to not like somebody. What's wrong is to treat somebody like you don't like them. Jesus put it this way. So, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? If you love those people who are just like you, if that's all you're known for, if you're against the rest of the world, the people who don't look like you, vote like you, act like you, live like you, behave like you, whatever, even born in the same country you're born into, if you love those who love you, what reward will you get? I mean, the tax collectors, aren't they doing that? And if you greet only your people, that word greet is a word that means treat with kindness. If you treat with kindness only those of your own people, well, what are you doing more than any others? Even the tax collectors and the unbelievers, somebody pointed out, their version said pagan. They said that seems like kind of a harsh word. Well, pagan does seem like a harsh word. I think it's in the NIV, but pagan in their society didn't really mean the same thing pagan means here. In their society, pagan simply meant a person who wasn't Jewish, kind of like foreigner to them. It was a person that wasn't of their race. And the unbelievers, well, they do that. And what Jesus is saying here is this: when we are with people who are like us, think like us, behave like us, all other, well, it's easy to love them. It's easy to love them in both in feeling and in action, isn't it? I mean, that's the easy thing to do. That's good, and that's expected, and that's what you find in any kingdom of the world. But Jesus isn't teaching us how to live in any kingdom of the world, is he? Jesus is teaching us how to live, how to be citizens of the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus says, make no mistake about it. As much as you would like for it to, my kingdom does not operate like human kingdoms. The kingdom of heaven looks like and acts like its king, which is what he means in verse 48 when he sums the last verse of this whole chapter up by saying, therefore, to sum it all up, if you want to know where all of this has been leading, and if you want to know what all of this has been building to tell you what all this stuff we've been talking about, murder and adultery and divorce and keeping your word and not looking back or getting even and loving your enemies, what it's all been headed towards, it's this: therefore be perfect. And you look at that and you think, well, we're sunk on the front end. Like, if you're asking me to be perfect, well, I've already messed up today. I'm going to tell you on the way out, something's gone wrong. Well, that's because that word perfect doesn't mean in their language what it means in our language. Perfect means without fault, doesn't it? Perfect in their language, you know what it meant? It meant be mature. It carried the idea that there is this goal that you're looking for, and it's a perfect goal, and you're going towards it, and you're on the way. It actually comes from the word telos in the Greek, which meant to mature. It's found several places in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. It describes someone who has reached this incredible point in their journey with God. They are mature. They have reached a goal. So really what Jesus is saying is this to his followers who are out there: do you want to know if you're maturing in me? Well, of all the ways I was taught to measure that, how many times do you go to church? I'm not saying don't come to church. Make sure you do things like this and don't do things like this and, all this stuff in order. Jesus says, you want to know how a person is becoming mature, is perfecting, is kind of the language there, their life. He says, well, it's not because they memorized 100 Bible verses or led a small group or got perfect attendance for the year. All of those things are good, and I hope that we continue to do all of those things. Jesus says, you're mature You know your teleos. You know you have reached the goal when you can agape your enemies, even though you don't feel good about them. When you can get past the way you feel and act in love towards them anyway. When you can return kindness for evil. When you can return good for bad. When you can, as Jesus has just put it, turn one cheek for the other. Walk 2 miles with someone who forced you to go 1. When you learn to give to the one who asked you and not turn away. When you would offer your coat to someone who would sue you and take your shirt. Not just to the people you call your friends, but to those you call your enemies, he says, then you can know something about yourself. You are becoming teleos. You are becoming mature. You are perfecting yourselves just like your heavenly Father is perfect, mature. Because agape love, agape love has the power to change what you think about people. I have seen it in my life. I'm sad to say that if you looked at my life 15 to 20 years ago, I classified people by a whole lot of different things. Even been accused over the last 10 years of being, in one party or another party because of things that I've said. But I have prayed that God would mellow me to the point where I look past all those lines and human things. And it doesn't mean that I have feelings about them. It just means, wow, my feelings towards the person has got to be so much higher than any way somebody acts or behaves or votes or thinks. I got to be a person who loves people. Agape love will make you go back on your word. Have you ever promised a child to punish them, only to a little bit later go and say, well, maybe it wasn't so bad? And you come alongside them. Why do you do that? Because in the moment you look at them in a way, oh my heavens. Agape love will make you go the extra mile. Agape love will make you apologize even though you thought you were right. Agape love will make you feed someone who cursed you out. Agape love will make you call somebody even though it may make you look weaker. Because agape love isn't a feeling. Agape love is an action. Which is why in the story we read last week of the Good Samaritan, when the lawyer asked the question, who is my neighbor? One version said he did so because he was looking for a loophole. But agape love has no loopholes. Agape love doesn't ask what they did, why they did it, or who they did it with. Agape love doesn't ask whether you agree or disagree. All those things may come at some other time. Agape love says, in spite of all of those other things, I will choose to act in kindness towards you. And it's all over the pages of Scripture from beginning to end. The Samaritan we call good, acting in kindness towards a man his society would have taught him to hate, and a man his society would have taught that man to hate the Samaritan. Stephen in Acts 8, when the people are stoning him, the word that's used of him is agape when he looked up into heaven. And as they were killing him, he said, Father, do not lay this sin against them. And on the cross was the ultimate act of agape love to people who had not earned it or deserved it. And it was demonstrated most eloquently when Jesus looked down at those who had nailed him there and said, Father, would you forgive them? They don't even know what they're doing. And in case you didn't know, the following 2 verses speak of agape love. One you know well, John 3:16. We read it, for God so loved. If you were Greek, you would have read it, for God so agape the world. It wasn't that he felt good about how the world had turned out or what had happened in the world, or even felt good about what all the people in the world were doing. It just says that he acted in love towards them in spite of what they had done. And he chose by giving us his one and only Son. It's the same word Paul uses in Romans 5:8 when he says, for God, get this, not felt, but showed his love. What word do you think the writer uses there? He showed agape for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ did what? Died for us. The version that has spoken to my heart over the years says, for while you were running away from God, Tom, God was running towards you. For I say to you, agape your enemies. It's not a feeling, Jesus says. It's a choice that makes you look an awful lot like your Father who is in heaven. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who use you, so that you may show yourselves to be children of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to shine, and he causes his rain to come on the just and the unjust, the righteous and the unrighteous. So you, therefore, seek to be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. For I say to you, agape your enemies. It was for them, and it still is, the hardest thing that any of us will ever do. But I think a challenge that each of us should seriously consider taking up in our lives. Father, you challenge me beyond measure. I walked with you for 60 years, and yet your word still falls fresh every morning. I pray, Father, for this body of people that we call family. I thank you, Father, for the ways that they love on our neighbors. I thank you, Father, for the ways that you've allowed us to come alongside people. And I pray, Father, that we become a people who love not just our neighbors, who don't narrowly define who we're going to love so that we can legally kind of limit our love. But we would be a people who love without limits, a people who learn, Father, to act in kindness towards those people around us who may not return the favor. Father, I thank you for doing that for us. And the whole church at NorthField said,